If you go looking for resolution in Richard Powers' novel Galatea 2.2, you run up against one of the basic questions of this course. Why do humans write so much? Why do we indulge a storytelling impulse from the very beginning? Helen asks the question of Rick on page 291 in the novel. Why do humans write so much? Why do they write at all, she asks. I read her one of the great moments in contemporary American fiction. Rick says, Nabokov's Post to Lolita. He describes hearing of an ape who produced the first known work of animal art, a rough sketch of the bars of the beast's cage. I told Helen that inside such a cage as ours, a book bursts like someone else's cell specifications, and the difference between two cages completes an inductive proof of thought's infinitude. There's a basic, promise of connection within the novel. There's a basic kind of promise of connectedness that comes out of story. In the end, someone starts a story and you're engaged. Is there kind of a basic human storytelling impulse that's a part of us in the end? And does that come out in not only novels and short stories, but in fairy tales and myths as well? The English writer E.M. Forster always said that the pull of fiction was, in the end, that fiction opened up a sense of the hidden life that was kind of buried deep inside of us, that fiction offers us a glimpse into someone else's secrets and the things that they don't vocalize or are unwilling or afraid to tell in life. And my question for you is, as we read Powers' novel here, does fiction offer that glimpse of hidden life in the end? Are you drawn into a story because you feel that there's something very human that's going to be related through story? Do narrators offer you a hint of human consciousness? You've seen plenty of narrators or frames for narration in the stories here, the kind of bizarre narrators that come out of Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber, the narrator of Galatea 2.2, Rick, or Ash's story in Jesmond Ward's novel. In what ways do narrators offer that hint of human consciousness? And given Powers' kind of scope of work in his lifetime, does that consciousness need to always be human? So, for instance, in his recent novel, The Overstory, which is, it's kind of a hint of, does nature have its own sense of consciousness? And he explores the story of trees in a forest. Do they communicate, and do they have a kind of a working consciousness that kind of drives the life of the forest? If you look at Galatea 2.2 in that way, does Powers here perhaps explore a sense of consciousness within technology? What is the source or the root of that consciousness there, as he explores the boundaries between human consciousness and what may be developed as robotic consciousness as well? If we think about it that way, I'd like to ask you a couple things, like how do you read these various points of the novel as you think about Galatea 2.2 as an exploration of human and non-human worlds? How do you understand Ricky's kind of initiating problem, as a character, or the drive that's there? On 215, he summarizes that problem as I wanted to write an encyclopedia of the information age, I lost myself in data. In what ways do you also feel lost in data at this point? And how can you empathize with Rick as a character, being kind of completely immersed in technology and being driven by technology in your working lives and your private lives? In what ways does data determine you as a human being? How do you read Helen's voice in dialogue with Ricky and Lentz? Do you start to read her as another human presence within the novel, or do you resist reading her that way within the novel? I think it's one of those kind of basic questions you kind of have to come to terms with as a reader. In what ways do you get drawn into her as being a character? In what ways do you have to resist that because she isn't quote unquote human here? How do you read Ricky's attachment to Helen in the end? And his attachment, and how does that compare to his attachments to A, the graduate student in English, and the memory of C, his past lover? Does Ricky have a human attachment to Helen in the end, particularly when he learns of Lentz's plan to, disfigure Helen, as a research subject at the end of the project here? And also here, how do you read Ricky's attachments to past, present, and future? He'll note that Helen learned how story recalls words to a moment before now left home. Does Ricky live in the past, present, or future in this novel? He, seems to have cut himself off from the future, with the exception of, his imaginary future with A. But does he seem to be more attached to the past or present? Helen seems to pull him more into the present, but does he ever get there by the novel's end? That seems to be a great point of conflict and tension in the novel that never seems to quite resolve itself by the story's end. So if you look for resolution in this novel, right, do you have a moment of, and the moral of the story is, fairy tales and myths, seem to offer a hint of that moral at the end. But how do you read those things as teaching stories? Does the things that you've read in the class so far, do they offer you a new sense of what fairy tales and myths do? Particularly as they are, kind of rooted in contemporary fiction. How or what does one learn from a fairy tale in that regard? And I want to offer you to kind of think about the complexity of resolution now in fairy tales. How do the meanings change when you hear or read them now versus in childhood? You have these kind of flat characters when you read fairy tales or you hear fairy tales in childhood, Little Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel and Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and there seems to be a real clear moral from all of these things. But when you start to kind of trouble or disturb the consciousness of those flat characters, what happens to the fairy tales themselves, and what happens to any sense of moral that might be there? Has Angela Carter and her writing, kind of pushed you to think about the complexities there versus the ways in which you heard or read fairy tales within childhood, and how does that disturb your sense of resolution in Galatea 2.2? That Rick will admit late in the novel, as he gets a sense that Helen is only a project that's going to disappear soon. If Helen was indeed was gone, I too was lost. And so he attaches himself, to Helen's consciousness in the novel, and kind of stakes his own sense of place in the world to it to some degree. Does fiction in that regard, and the novel in particular, does it offer a means of exploring other frames for consciousness here? Right? You think through the character. You think through the character's attachments within a story. You think through a character's sense of place within the world. And if you can begin to read the novel that way, and kind of with a kind of a mythic sense, does Galatea 2.2 offer a mythic version of a technological world? Does it kind of offer you a way to think about the world in mythic terms? That cell phone you have in your hand, or that laptop that you work on, in what ways is that a mythic object? And in what ways do we develop mythologies of technology in the ways that we regard them and the ways that we work with them? Do we see technology as a human creation or as a non-human thing in the end? And what myths do we think through, or what myths do we tell, or what myths does the culture tell us in thinking about technology as a human or non-human creation here? Does myth offer a means of reinterpreting human relationship to technology? That's the question I want you to kind of think about here in this novel, versus it being something other than human, as some aspect of what's human. So do we start to think about technology as a foreign, separate, othered thing, or is it just simply a human creation or a tool that reveals some aspect of ourselves? I think that's one of those points in Powers novel that's worth exploring in thought is, in what ways did this novel kind of cause you to rethink technology as a human creation in the end? And if you want to think about recovering story as a central human act in this regard, is there always a resolution to the story? And in that regard, I want to kind of isolate a moment here within Powers' novel. There's a moment where Helen turns to Rick and asks, "What do I look like, Richard? Please show me." As he started to kind of unveil the world to Helen in the end, not only through story but through images. Note here what Rick's response is. He responds, "I pictured her so many different ways over the course of the training. A cycladic figure, a Feininger, or a Pollock. I turned up a suitable likeness." She asked, "It's a photo? It's someone you knew once? A woman friend?" She would have pretended ignorance for me, would have let me off the hook again, except that she had to know. Is that basic kind of curiosity that's there, that Helen picks up through story, is that also kind of a very basic human trait? That stories push us to know more. Stories push us to understand one another, push us into one another's consciousness. And in what ways does Powers' novel, drive that impulse, perhaps? Thanks.